Stephen King's The Gunslinger is the first book in the Dark Tower series. It is also the first book that I ever chose to read, of my own volition. Since I picked it up that first time, I've read it 5 times total. There are 2 different versions of this book. There's the revised version and the original. I've done the original version 2 times, and I have done the revised version 3 times. It was originally published as 5 separate short stories, and they were later collected into this book, which heads the Dark Tower series, which now is, 8 books long. It's 8 books long, 7 in the core franchise, and then there's one additional one that's kind of supposed to be slipped into the middle, but we'll get to them individually. The Gunslinger is easily the shortest book in the series. It's only approximately 62,000 words. That's 216 pages in trade paperback. Comparing this to Stephen King's other books, not just books in this series, but just other books that Stephen King has written, it is remarkably short, and it blows through very quickly. The good news is, even though it's particularly short, it does not feel like we've sacrificed very much in character or very much in world building either. There's a lot of genre play in this. You can't nail down the Dark Tower to any one specific genre. Fantasy is the best and easiest thing to mention that it is, and also Western, but it covers quite a number of different genres. Within, Roland, a lone gunslinger, crosses a vast inhospitable desert on foot in relentless pursuit of an evil wizard known as the Man in Black. The gunslinger's mind, body, and spirit are tested against the Man in Black's cruel and clever magic, the deadly denizens of the desert, and the gunslinger's own history. Roland is singular in his goal, willing to cut down anyone and anything that stands between him and the Dark Wizard, though catching the Man in Black is only the first step on the long path that leads to the mythic Dark Tower. The Gunslinger does read a little bit strange, especially if you're reading the original text. Again, this was 5 short stories that were put together into one book. There was not very much editing done from their original publication in the magazine to their collection in the original version of The Gunslinger, and because of that, it's going to affect the way that the book reads. It does read a little bit clunky, and altogether, at the end of the book, it does feel almost a little bit incomplete, and that's because this book functions more like a prologue for the entire series than necessarily its own standalone book. Now, the revised edition does address that a little bit. The Gunslinger Revised feels a little bit more like its own complete story, like it has its own statements, its own things to do. But the original book just kind of feels like a little bit disconnected from the rest of the series. This series started in the 1970s and it was finished, I think, in 2003. At least book 7 came out in 2003, I think. Maybe it was 2004. The original version, though, just doesn't stand up alone completely on its own. The reason, however, why I do go through and read The Gunslinger is because this is a comfort read for me. It tugs on the heartstrings a little bit. Stephen King's characters are the reason why you usually read his books. Roland is the main character in this story. Roland is the titular gunslinger, and he is a very good gunslinger. Not necessarily morally speaking. He's not evil, but he's not morally the good guy. He is a good gunslinger in the fact that he is possibly the sharpest gunslinger there ever was. He could shoot just about fucking anything. He is wonderful with those guns, and he demonstrates it several times throughout this book. It is clear, the entire book, that Roland is seeking the Dark Tower. The Dark Tower is not very well explained as to what it is in this book. We'll get to that in the later series. He is very stoic in nature. He does not laugh very much, doesn't make very many jokes. He descends from the kingdom of Gilead. He is effectively the prince. The most important thing about him as a character is the fact that he is really unflinching in his goals. When Roland wants something, he goes after it, and he does not stop until he has it. And he exemplifies that not only in this book, but again and again and again. Now, one thing about him that you really wouldn't expect by what I've mentioned so far, he really loves to tell stories. In The Gunslinger alone, he stops and tells a story at least twice that I can think of off the top of my head, and in later books, he tells a lot more stories. So we'll get to those when we get there, but who'd have thunk it? He's definitely a storyteller. It definitely fits the cowboy trope that he will, sit and talk about shit around a campfire and all that kind of stuff, but it's just, I don't know, given that he's like the best badass in the entire world with his 6 shooters, It's just odd that he happens to be, also quite a talker if you can actually get his mouth open. So Roland, of course, chases the Man in Black, and we don't get to know too very much about the Man in Black through this book. We do know that he is, of course, a wizard, and he uses his magic for ill gains. He's definitely an asshole, and he does not like Roland. Roland and the Man in Black do have a history together. I won't mention too much because I don't want to spoil things at the moment. However, Roland is chasing the Man in Black because allegedly the Man in Black has information about the Dark Tower, and the Dark Tower is what Roland ultimately seeks. In the desert, Roland meets Jake. Jake is, depending on which version you read, I think in the original version he's like 9, and in the revised version he's like 11, I think. But regardless, that doesn't make too much of a difference. Jake is a fine character. He's interesting, comes from New York, died at one point, comes over here. We don't want to talk too much about him, though. Roland takes a shine to Jake for reasons that aren't exactly clear at the moment. Again, explained later in the series. Jake was a kind of a weird addition to it. He didn't really add that much to the story, with one very major notable exception we'll talk about in a little bit. Unfortunately, he just kind of tags along for the whole book and doesn't do too much. That's really the biggest misstep that Stephen King has in this book. But no, there are plenty of other characters. This is a Stephen King book, so there's going to be a bajillion characters, and most of them are never going to come up again. Brown and Zoltan the Raven, you get to meet them at the very beginning of the book, and they always stick out. They're some of the first characters you meet, so I'm bound to remember them at the least. There's, Alice and all the residents of Tull, also at the very first chapter, you get to meet them, and then, they're gone for the entire rest of the story. You get to meet Elaine and Cuthbert, although both of them aren't really, like too big of a part of this story. They don't come in until, again, later in the series. We're on to the spoiler part, so spoilers. Yeah. It is, unfortunately, a little bit confusing as to why Roland wants to get to the Dark Tower throughout this book. Stephen King makes it amazingly evident that Roland needs to get there, and later in the series, it becomes very clear as to why he needs to get there. Now, granted, I don't think Stephen King understood that he was going to really go places with this story. This was written in the 1970s as a short story, probably didn't think he was ever going to sequelize the short story, or ever have them collected together, or ever continue on. So because of that, it really does feel a little bit confusing as to why he needs to go to the Dark Tower. It felt like just something that's just sprinkled in there just because it's the reference to the poem that inspired the story. In the grand scheme of things, of course, it's necessary, but in and of itself, that's one of the things that does detract from what is otherwise, in my opinion, a pretty darn fun book. Speaking of fun, gunning everybody down in Tull is one of the most fun scenes to read. It is just absolutely nuts. You get to just see how cold and heartless Roland can be when he is just mechanically and systematically at work. He is a gunslinger. His job is to shoot things, and he shoots them really fucking well and really fucking fast. And he's really good. Man, just explaining, like, the reloading trick that he does. We talk about that reloading trick a number of times again throughout the book. The entire series. Probably the most emotional moment in the book is when Roland has to drop Jake. You go then, there are other worlds than these. So on and so forth, right? That definitely hits hard for a lot of people. And of course, it's hard for me as well. It was really sad to see him just kill the kid. But again, Jake was kind of wasted in this book. He could have been used way, way more. If Stephen King was able to find a way to have utilized Jake more, and even just built the relationship between the gunslinger and Jake, it would have made that sacrifice just a little bit more impactful. Or maybe I've just read the book 5 times and I've become, a little hardened to seeing Jake die. Who knows? Another one of the more just excellent actions scenes was when Roland has to fight Court with David the Bird. Wow. I don't really have too much to add there, just wow, I fucking love that scene. It's so cool. Roland meeting with the Oracle in the mountains there is just a weird scene. That whole chapter is just weird. I feel like that chapter could just be chopped out of the book, other than the fact that it really does, of course, tie into some important shit that happens later in the series. That's like everything in this book really ties into shit that happens later on, and it just doesn't fit all entirely into itself. That's the biggest downfall of this, because this Oracle comes into play again later. Everything about the Man in Black comes into play later. Jake comes into play later. The whole book is a gigantic prologue. That's all the Gunslinger is. And that's fine. It's not terrible, because, we've got the rest of the series that we can get into. It's just, by itself, if nothing else was ever published and the Gunslinger was the only thing that did come of the Dark Tower, it would be pretty anticlimactic. Specifically about that Oracle, though, the Oracle, the weird demon lady thing that he meets right next to the mountains, near that weird Stonehenge thing that you see in the illustrations. What the fuck was that about, man? Like, why is he fucking the demon? Go for it, dude. I guess, if you can, cool, do it. But that's just, what an odd thing. And specifically the fact that that specifically comes back around in the weirdest way. I don't know. Out of all of the shit that Stephen King's written, he's written even weirder things. He's written much more fucked up stuff. This was the first book I chose to read. The first book that I myself was just like, that one. I want to read that book. That sounds fun to me. I'm not going to let some other motherfucker tell me what to read. I'm going to go pick that shit up. And I did. And this is what I get. Don't get me wrong. I'm not complaining. I've read the book 5 fucking times. I've read it 4 times since that first time. So, obviously, it doesn't bother me that much. But just, it was so strange reading that for the first time as a kid. It was just what the fuck is going on? Now, granted, maybe 12 was too young to actually pick up Stephen King. Actually, was I 12? Hold on, oh my god, no, I was 9. Wait a second, I was in the 4th grade when I read Stephen King, so I think I was 9. Shit, I was 9 years old when I read this book for the first time. Holy shit, it's been a long time since I first read this book, and it just blew my mind reading this when I was a kid. It was just what the fuck, it's so violent, it's so fantasy, it was just... I don't get it. It was weird. The whole book is weird. On to the illustrations. They are all beautiful. Every single one of the illustrations in this book is beautiful. Michael is, I think it's Whalen, I think is how you say his name, Michael Whalen. Oh my god. I think he produced several just beautiful oil paintings for this. All of them immaculately done. My favorite one is probably Roland saving Jake from the Slow Mutants. It's a very dark image. The only light that comes from it is from the gun going off. Just a beautiful image. My least favorite would probably be the one of Roland sitting next to the circle of stones, right next to where the Oracle is that we just talked about. And yeah, he's just kind of sitting there reaching into the water, and it's not that it's a bad painting. All of them are just gorgeous. It's just my least favorite of them. In conclusion, I love The Gunslinger deeply, even though it is a bit flawed at certain points here and there. As much as I love it, as many times as I have read this book, I can only say it's not actually even the best book in the series. This is only the 4th best book in the series, in my opinion. And altogether, I'm going to give it a B+, I think. The pacing was particularly good. It always ran very quickly without ever sacrificing any of the world building. The atmosphere is very rich, just as rich as all of the characters, with one character withstanding we mentioned earlier. The fantasy elements were unique and interesting to me. However, it does feel a little bit disjointed, especially compared to the rest of the books in the franchise. Am I going to reread this book? Yes, I'm certain that I'm going to reread this book again. I don't know how long it's going to be until I do, but I will. When I need to, I will. Without The Gunslinger, I don't think that I myself would have been able to carry on with my career. I myself am a writer, and I have put out a couple of books. Surprise, I'm going to sell you shit. Here I have The Circus, an American fantasy. Within, Penny Robinson finds herself trapped in an enormous, otherworldly circus where capitalism is king, crime runs rampant, and souls are currency. The only chance for survival is to abandon morality and bend to the whims of the circus dictator, or risk her life and break the system she's become trapped in. Here I have Portraits in Bloodlines. Portraits in Bloodlines is 23 short stories in the horror, fantasy, science fiction, and slipstream genre, among others. A little bit of everything for everyone in Portraits in Bloodlines. My wife and I are collecting more and more films. If you're curious about our collection, head over to her channel where she's documenting that process. If you have any suggestions for books that I should read, please do let me know. I'm always looking for new books to read. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Take care. Another interesting part about the battle in Tull, and I've talked with my cousin about this, he specifically singles this out as his maybe favorite part of the book. He's talking about how Roland has been going and the shootouts happening, he's gunning people down, and he realizes that he's been screaming all along. And that just really, my cousin wanted me specifically to mention that here, so there you go. I mentioned it for you.